Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We're going to talk about protecting on-prem AD domain controllers today. Now, we did do an episode way back, probably one of our first episodes, on protecting on-prem infrastructure. And that was more identity focused, but we're going to specifically talk about the keys to the kingdom today, domain controllers. And one of the things I think is important for security folks to always try to do is review configurations and go back, because most of the time at companies, Active Directory was stood up a long time ago. And there may not even have been security folks at that company when AD was stood up. In fact, most likely there were not. And so it's always good to take a look and see if there's any improvements that can be made, because even incremental changes can make a difference. And so let's start first with talking about protecting it from an architectural standpoint. One of the things is you need to be considering the operating system that your domain controllers are on. Right now, we have Server 2019 and Server 2022 just came out, but I'm willing to bet if you take a look at your operating systems, you may be running some Server 2012 or Server 2016. And so there needs to be an ongoing project to continually update these legacy server operating systems. For sure, if you have any 2008 R2 servers, those should be decommissioned as soon as possible. But right now, you should be looking at every single domain controller that has 2012, because that goes end of life next year, October 10th, 2023. In fact, Adam and I talked to a customer this week who had a couple hundred servers that were domain controllers, and only a fraction of them were running 2016, and the majority of them were 2019. So they had probably over 100 domain controllers that were 2012. Did I say 2012? I think I said 2019, but yeah, so 2012, they were running 2012 on the majority of their domain controllers. And that was an issue because we were talking to them about Windows Hello for Business. And if you remember from Windows Hello for Business architecture, you do need to have 2016 domain controllers or higher to do key trust as well as cloud key trust. So that's the first point. Make sure that your infrastructure team is continually updating as a project all the domain controllers to the latest operating systems. The second one we're going to just touch on is identity and access management. You do want to limit the use of domain admin privileges. Now, we did touch on this in our episode previously. I would recommend having very limited domain admins, as well as using that as a separate credential. You may have a server admin, your regular user, but I would have domain admin as this completely separate one that you rarely ever log into. And then use like jump boxes for RDP access. Generally, you don't want to RDP directly into a domain controller from your unsecured endpoint. I know at Microsoft, they use PAWS, so a privileged access workstation, that is highly secure to get into any type of privileged management of any critical infrastructure. So if you can't do that, you can always use like a jump box that is highly managed to get into that instead of from your endpoint. And then ADFS, right? If you're using ADFS, highly recommend to you that you move to an IDP. But until then, you want to treat your ADFS servers as well as your AD sync servers as basically domain controllers. They should be tier 1 critical assets. They should be treated the exact same with the exact same security policies, secure access to the ADFS servers and AD sync, because if you compromise ADFS servers or compromise AD sync, you will have the keys to the kingdom. Any thoughts on those particular first two there, Adam?
So I personally have I've worked many roles in IT. Infrastructure is not one of them. So in terms of running servers and kind of all of that sort of thing, I haven't done it. So I don't appreciate the challenges of that work. So I just want to call that out, that it's easy to armchair quarterback something when you don't always understand the complexities. However, it would seem to me as a security professional that for something as critical and as sensitive as a domain controller, and especially something where it has very natural high availability, failover, Windows clients are very good about, I can't talk to that DC, I'll go talk to another one. You've got DC replication. It has a lot of fault tolerance built into it, that taking a single DC offline to upgrade it to a more recent or the current server operating system, to me, would make a lot of sense. I don't want critical infrastructure in my environment running on old operating systems. So again, I don't appreciate all the complexities involved there, but from my armchair quarterback perspective, it just seems like it would make sense to me that that's actually something you would emphasize upgrading first and really keeping up to date and all of that. So that surprises me. And then as Andy, as you mentioned, you start to have knock-on effects where not only because you haven't kept it up to date and it is now technical debt, you now have a short runway to get them all upgraded. You've got about 17 months starting right now. So that's not a ton of time. If you have hundreds of domain controllers and less than 15% are upgraded, well, that sounds to me like you're going to have to do, several DCs every single month for the next 17 months to make your deadline. That's not great. And that limits your ability to be agile in other areas. And then it limits your ability to access new cool technologies like Windows Hello for Business, where there's this super simple deployment model of cloud key trust that we talked about on this show. And if you have that technical debt where you can't easily move to that is frustrating. And in the case of that customer we talked about, a new CIO had come in, and I'm going to extrapolate here. I'm going to assume CIO came from a company that had Windows Hello for Business, came to a new company that didn't have it, and said, what the heck? Get it going. And now that technical debt is going to limit their ability to do something quickly and or force them into decisions they may not have wanted, like deploying as certificate trust model, which is a fine model, but has additional complexity that technical debt has now caused. And so that's where technical debt becomes a snowball of technical debt, in that technical debt over here forces you to make suboptimal decisions over there. And now you've got a real problem on your hands. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to keep that updated. As far as the identity stuff, I think you nailed it. ADFS, treat as tier one. Absolutely. Any organization that has had the cloud go down because their ADFS went down feels that pain when Microsoft 365 is perfectly operational, but because your infrastructure has failed, you can't get to where you want to be. Or in the case of a lot of those SolarWinds attacks and compromises, they were using some of the keys from ADFS to forge tokens and do all sorts of not great stuff. So it is a very, very sensitive asset as well, because ADFS basically hands out the tokens that cloud services trust to give you access. And if you're doing something like synchronizing cloud administrative accounts from on-premises accounts, which on this show we have told you maybe you shouldn't do anymore, but let's say you do and ADFS gets compromised, well, it's super easy to forge a token that says, hey, I'm the global admin. What's up? Let's have some fun. So good call outs there for sure. I think interesting conversation, right? I mean, we don't always talk about things as simple as domain controllers, but it's good to unpack some of this.
So the next one is applications and internet access. So I'm going to group these together, but the recommendation from Microsoft, and there is a document, official documentation on how to protect domain controllers, which I'll link in the show notes. But the recommendation from Microsoft is to not install, or install only applications that you absolutely need, but really, really try not to install any third-party applications if you don't have to. Now, in the past, there has actually been a little bit of an argument among information security professionals on should you install an endpoint protection product on those domain controllers. Some security professionals think that you shouldn't, because you should limit internet access and you shouldn't have another product that could be compromised. It's introducing attack surface. And some people believe that you should put it on there because it's monitoring and you're trying to detect threats and all this other stuff. One of the things that Microsoft did recently was update the documentation to protecting domain controllers to include that we are no longer recommending that domain controllers have zero internet access. Now, previously that was a recommendation that no internet access should be had from domain controllers. But now we're saying, hey, due to the modern threat landscape, cloud is a necessity. We often say cloud is a security imperative. And so in order to gain insight and monitoring and detection and response, you do need a modern EDR solution. And so I'm guessing, we don't publish this publicly, but my guess is Microsoft Corporation's domain controllers are probably running Defender for Server and are onboarded into Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And so you can limit the traffic to just that particular product. You don't have to open it up to the entire internet. As well as, I'm sure we're running Microsoft Defender for Identity, which is our on-prem identity threat solution. And those require agents that are installed on domain controllers as well that have to communicate to the cloud to sync the data. And I'm sure that we allow that particular traffic. And so that's the update in the documentation and the recommendation, where it's no longer no internet, but you're still limiting internet access as much as possible and limiting it to only your threat landscape solutions that you have deployed there so you can have insight. The other thing is you shouldn't have any web browsers. You should limit launching web browsers, and you shouldn't be able to browse to whatever you want. There is another way to protect against that as well. Some people like to deploy the command line Windows server. And so a lot of domain controllers can be deployed this way. It prevents you from RDPing to it. It prevents you from having a GUI and installing applications like through a GUI and just downloading an exe. You can still install applications through a command line, but you have to be technical enough to do that. And so your lower level or not as skilled IT folks, if they get in there, and they see the command line right away and they're expecting a Windows Server GUI for you to be able to do stuff in, they will not be able to just automatically do that. So that's one way to have replication and failover of your domain controllers, but also kind of protect against that very low hanging fruit, I would say, of like the non-skilled attacker who will get in there and just realize, hey, it's command line. Like, what do we do here? So it adds a little bit more complexity. It also like forces some IT admins to just back away and like, I'm not going to install anything because it's command line. So those are the recommendations for applications and internet access.
That reminds me of the argument that a manual transmission is like an anti-theft device for a vehicle because most thieves wouldn't know how to drive it and can't steal it then. Third-party applications on domain controllers obviously limit. EDR, like I get both arguments. I would say you should put EDR on. Now, I think one interesting point to consider is if you're going to put an endpoint protection platform on your domain controllers, maybe that would be a use case, even if you don't use it organizationally, where you would use Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And part of the reason why is because of two reasons. Number one, the client, the agent, I guess I should call it, is built into the operating system, essentially. And so you haven't really introduced as much new attack surface as when you're installing like a CrowdStrike or a Sentinel-1 or whatever, because it's already native to the operating system. It already ships with it. You're just really enabling it. So that's one point. The other point is that is sandboxed as well. And so it's isolated from the rest of the operating system as much as logically possible. And that also helps reduce attack surface and threat. And some of those things are just by virtue of Microsoft publishing the operating system as well as the endpoint protection platform that Microsoft's able to do those things. And so if you're not comfortable with the concept of running just unfettered third-party code on your domain controller, which I align with, that might be an option where you can still have an endpoint protection platform, but maybe something that has less attack surface and might be more comfortable using. So that's one thought. The other thing you kind of talked about there was how Microsoft's guidance had changed as far as internet access to domain controllers. And Andy, you kind of hit all the major points on the head that we've talked about on this show many times, that the cloud has really become a security imperative. You actually use that phrasing. And what that really means is it's hard to go it alone because you don't know what you don't know. You don't have visibility into the threat landscape. When you're able to take a threat that attacks someone else halfway around the world and build that protection against you, and third parties do this, Microsoft does this, most security vendors do this, that is way more powerful than just kind of isolating yourself from the world and hoping nothing bad happens. And so that's kind of where that guidance comes from. But I also want to point something out as well. Microsoft is a really, really big company. I know, Captain Obvious, right? But literally 200,000 plus employees and contractors and people in various roles. So there isn't just one voice that speaks as Microsoft, the whole entity. There are many different parts of the company that speak with different voices. And obviously the goal is to speak unified as much as possible, but that doesn't always happen. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Microsoft published all the way back in 2016 modern guidance on passwords, like eliminating character complexity requirements, eliminating periodic password resets, and some of those sorts of things that have now become much more common, and they're written into a NIST standard and so on. At that time, and for many years thereafter, if you got a security baseline for Windows Server or Windows Client as well, actually, it's still recommended you do a security setting like a GPO or whatever to have periodic password expiration. And so those didn't come into alignment, I think, till either 2018 or 2019, when there was finally alignment on the security baselines aligned up with the password guidance that had been published 3 years prior. So there isn't just one voice that speaks of all of Microsoft. So the fact that Microsoft was shipping a product, Defender for Identity, that had an agent that ran on domain controllers didn't necessarily line up one-to-one for Microsoft to say, yes, we now recommend that it is okay to have internet access in your domain controllers. Those are kind of separate parts of the company. So the fact that they're aligned today is fantastic and gives clarity to security defenders, but just keep that in mind that sometimes people ascribe this gigantic company with all these different pieces to it as speaking with one voice all of the time. There isn't just one voice. And the better you understand that, the better you'll be able to kind of contextualize and interact with Microsoft. And obviously it's a goal to be as consistent as possible, but sometimes different areas have different priorities and different recommendations. And sometimes people don't agree on everything, and that's okay too. Healthy disagreement is a good thing. So, the argument I think has finally become embraced that tools like an endpoint protection platform or a Defender for Identity or some of the competitive products like CrowdStrikes are very, very valuable and better off than having the domain controller sitting, isolated with no protection on it. So just evolving kind of thought process as we go. And that's the fun part about this world, right? That's the fun part about being in InfoSec is if you're not willing to check your assumptions at the door and revisit them frequently, you're going to have a bad time. I like kind of having my assumptions challenged. I like that part of talking about this is to look at something I thought before and say, oh, well, now that this new information has come to light, I see it a different way.
I'm glad you said that because I think security professionals previously, might have had this attitude like, oh, I did it this way and this is the right way. and the way that you're doing it is wrong and you shouldn't be doing it that way. And I hope that most of us know that this landscape is always changing. And so we always have to adapt. We always have to change. The way that we're doing it today may not be the way that we want to do it tomorrow. There are smarter people in the industry than, Adam and I, and there's smarter people than probably the folks who are listening to this podcast. And, you should be open to learning new things and trying new ways all the time. Doesn't matter if you actually listen to them, but at least you should be open to hearing new ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So physical security. Now, obviously, many of you may have domain controllers sitting in the cloud, like Azure or AWS or GCP. And that's okay. But most likely, if you have infrastructure in the cloud, you probably have physical domain controllers sitting somewhere. So if you are hosting on-site or in colo, they should be in secure racks. You should have your physical security. There should be locked server rooms. And then within those server rooms, even the actual servers for these domain controllers should be in secured racks that only certain people can get to. Microsoft recommends that they be configured with TPM and encrypted with BitLocker. And even though BitLocker may add a small performance overhead, it'll protect the directory against a compromise if the disks are removed from the server. If you're implementing virtual domain controllers, so this I thought was also a really important part that I didn't take into consideration because I don't really get into the physical aspect of where the servers are located all the time. But if I was at a company, I would definitely take this and look at where they are today, because one of the recommendations for Microsoft is if you're hosting virtual domain controllers, let's say on Hyper-V or VMware, vSphere, or something like that, the domain controllers should be run on separate physical hosts than any other server in your environment, right? So that particular physical host should only have domain controllers and nothing else. I'd say maybe you could put your ADFS or AD sync server on it, maybe, because they're also considered tier 1, but it shouldn't be running against another server that's running some business application, right? That physical host should only be running tier 1 critical assets. And if you can't secure your domain controllers in a locked room or secure racks, you should consider deploying read-only domain controllers. And there's a whole documentation on how to deploy read-only domain controllers. So these were some physical security things that I never thought about when I was a security architect, but I would definitely go and take a look at this documentation and then go to my physical servers and take a look at what's going on there, because this is very important, right? I think most of the time in security, we say that if you have physical access, you basically have compromised, right? So physical security is very, very important, especially if you're hosting physical servers. And then you should take a look at your configurations. There's some basic configurations out there, even some newer ones. For example, there was a print spooler vulnerability. If you have some of our solutions from Microsoft, I'm sure in other vulnerability management solutions, they'll have these too, but they'll call out that you haven't disabled print spoolers on domain controllers. You should go and do that, because nobody should be printing from a domain controller. You should also be setting remote desktop security levels to TLS. Those are not default settings, so you should go in there, configure that. Disable SMB v1 support, right? When you stand up a server, that's not disabled by default. And so you should configure that, because it's a legacy protocol that uses the MD5 algorithm. And if you're in security, you know that MD5 has been vulnerable to attacks like collision and pre-imaging attacks for a while now. And so you should configure. So there's a lot of other configuration settings that you should go and review and make sure what group policies your domain controllers are actually getting, and review those configurations. And then finally, patch management. Now, I left this for last because, number one, we're going to have another episode on patch management coming up next week. But I found this to be interesting in the documentation where they talked about how you should be patching your domain controller separate from your other general Windows production environment. Not in the way because of like how often you should patch, but more like if you have a patch management solution, like for example, SCCM or some other on-prem, way of patching. Because if you're onboarding these to those patch management solutions, you're then introducing yet another agent and third-party software on those domain controllers, which again introduces more threat, right? It's another surface area of attack that could be compromised, another way in. And so they should be patched differently. You should have a different plan, whether it be manual or some other method of automation to patch these domain controllers, and not just the same way that you're doing it for your other Windows servers and endpoints.
That's a really interesting call out there on the patch management piece. And it's one of those pieces of guidance that's like, okay, that's interesting. How do we scale that? How do we do that? But it's an interesting call out, and I think of, since I'm such an identity guy, I think of that call out I made earlier about having privileged cloud identities synchronized from on-premises identities. And I think of the risk inherent there. And I've had customers push back on that because they don't want to manage those privileged identities separately in those cloud services because they're afraid, well, if Jane leaves the company and we forget to go term Jane's global admin account in M365 because it's entirely separate, well, now we have a problem on our hands. I'm like, totally get that. Versus when it's synchronized, we just have one identity to turn off. So sometimes it's about your ability to scale some of these recommendations. Sure, they could harden further, but some of them seem challenging to do. You could at least patch them on a different schedule. I mean, that would be relatively easy to do. And I bet a lot of customers already do that, but still, this is a really interesting call out here. I like it because it's got the old hamster wheel spinning.
I mean, one of the things you could do with domain controllers is just patch them via GPO. You can set, if you want to automate, the schedule without having to manually go into the domain controller, update and reboot, you could use GPO, which all domain controllers have, and you can set Windows updates through that. And that's not introducing any additional surface threat. So that's one idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the guidance, right? And everyone's got to do what's best for them. Mm-hmm. In our next episode, we'll talk about some automation on how to do automated patch management through some of the more modern solutions. But, if you don't want to manually go into each domain controller and do the updates, you can do it through GPO. I mean, that's built in and certainly more than capable of doing automated patch management, but maybe you want to say, don't reboot, right? Maybe you have your admins go in and reboot the domain controllers when that's most effective, or set a window during off hours to do that.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, this was really interesting to read through. I saw that we have some tech community articles that updated the guidance that talked about this. And then I read through the documentation, and certainly I learned a few things, and hopefully our listeners here learned a couple of things. I recommend that if you are using AD, that you go and take a look at this documentation on specifically securing domain controllers against attacks. So, and we'll put that documentation in the show notes. And that's our show for this week. Thanks as always for watching and listening. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you guys have any questions or topics you want us to talk about. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.